We asked Secretary Rumsfeld to come on the program at the bottom of the hour to discuss Libya. He has agreed at the last moment. We appreciate that. I'm a great admirer of his. All right, folks, there's a big debate going on in conservatism now. Glad to say that I helped launch it and have others, and it is very important. What is conservatism? I feel there are people who are dumbing it down, who are trying to redefine it and rewrite it to accommodate their own agenda. And in one of those areas, I see it as an attempt to promote a foreign policy agenda that is not conservative, and yet claims to be Reagan-esque when in fact it's not. We conservatives believe that the moral imperative of all public policy must be the preservation and improvement of American society. The object of American foreign policy should be no different than the object of American domestic policy. You know, America has, will, and must make alliances with non-democratic regimes from time to time, and even former enemies, if under the right circumstances doing so preserves and improves our society. During World War II, the United States allied with the Soviet Union in order to defeat the Axis powers, including Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a genocidal, imperialistic regime. But our survival was at stake. In fact, the alliance did preserve the nation. And subsequent to World War II, the Soviet Union was America's greatest threat. When Jimmy Carter based his foreign policy on advancing human rights worldwide, not only did the Soviet expansionism in Afghanistan, Africa, and Latin America, but also toppled the Shah of Iran, a longtime ally, and catalyzed the Islamic fundamentalist movement throughout the Middle East. Today, the Soviet Union does not exist, although Russia remains a threat, but the Islamic regime in Iran is on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons, and in my view is the single most destabilizing force in the Middle East. So this doctrinal rather than prudential promotion of democracy or human rights is practiced by Carter, and some people I like, Bill Kristol and so forth, and some of George Bush's former staffers, can be destructive, although unintentionally, of America's interests. It's a great piece in this regard in Real Clear Politics by an associate professor of public and international affairs at George Mason, Colin Dweck. Says when American conservatives reflect on concrete examples of undeniably successful modern conservative foreign policy presidents, they think first of Ronald Reagan. Indeed, the vast majority of conservatives hold up Reagan as a model of how to conduct U.S. foreign and defense policy, but they don't always agree on the day-to-day implications of the Reaganite model. For example, when Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, a long-standing American ally, was confronted with a popular protest movement earlier this year, some leading conservatives like Bill Kristol invoked the Reaganite legacy of democracy promotion in urging the U.S. to help topple the Egyptian autocrat. Other conservatives like Dick Cheney, Newt Gingrich, John Bolton, and Charles Krauthammer pointed out the danger that Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood might ultimately fill the gap left by Mubarak's departure. Since Republicans seem to agree that Reagan set the standard, it's worth asking, what exactly was his standard? There's no doubt Reagan believed democracies to be more peaceful, more trustworthy, and more just in their foreign policy behavior than authoritarian forms of government. In relation to U.S. adversaries at the time, including the Soviet Union and its client states, Reagan viewed the theme of democracy promotion as not only morally imperative, but strategically useful as a pressure point against hostile dictatorships. He therefore issued sharp, rhetorical, and ideological challenges, indicating his belief that the entire communist system of government was immoral, illegitimate, dysfunctional, and doomed. Obviously, Reagan was not shy about stating his sincere conviction in the inherent superiority of democracy. Yet, in relation to America's allies, he was usually quite circumscribed and subtle in his efforts at democracy promotion. He clearly believed within the context of the Cold War that there could hardly be anything worse for either democratic values or U.S. interests than the international spread of communism. And as I read the rest of this to you, substitute the word communism with fundamental Islam. Reagan's fundamental instinct, therefore, especially on first coming into power in 1981, was to bolster America's anti-communist allies worldwide rather than to hector them. In cases such as El Salvador and South Africa, allied governments were quietly nudged in a positive direction on democratic human rights, while reassured of ultimate American support In practical terms, therefore, Reagan was willing to materially aid a wide range of anti-communist insurgencies in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Africa, whether or not they lived up to strict standards of liberal propriety. A significant turning point for the Reagan administration came in 1986 when Filipino dictator, longtime U.S. ally Ferdinand Marcos, faced possible overthrow by domestic opponents. Reagan's initial instinct in the Filipino case, as always, was to back up his anti-communist ally. But the main opposition to Marcos inside the Philippines was neither communist nor anti-American. And when virtually the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment urged in favor of easing the aged Marcos out of office, Reagan was finally convinced to do so. And in fact, he sent an old friend of mine, Nevada Senator Paul Laxalt, to do it. Other U.S. allies in places like Chile and South Korea were pressed more aggressively on democracy and human rights issues during Reagan's second term. The final outcome by the time he left office in January 1989 was that numerous allied governments in East Asia and Latin America had moved in a democratic direction. Yet this was not simply the result of U.S. criticism and pressure. It was also very much the result of complicated internal factors combined with positive American assistance and reassurance regarding core security concerns. So the main lines of Reagan's record on democracy promotion can therefore be summarized briefly. Reagan distinguished between allies and adversaries. Let me underscore that. It was a point I was trying to make all through this Egyptian protest, upheaval, whatever you want to call it. Reagan distinguished between allies and adversaries, just as we did on this program. In relation to U.S. adversaries, Reagan issued ringing and sincere denunciations of undemocratic practices in order to indicate moral concern as well as to weaken hostile regimes. In relation to American allies, on the other hand, Reagan was usually much more circumspect because he understood that to destabilize an autocratic but U.S.-aligned government might very well lead to something worse. There was certainly some movement toward more pointed forms of pro-democracy pressure on U.S. allies during Reagan's second term, but even then, his first instinct was always to bolster, support, and reassure allies rather than to critique them. So what are the implications of Reagan's example today? Over the past 3 months, the Arab world has been caught up in a maelstrom of revolutionary political pressures, mostly against U.S. allied but autocratic governments. The United States has once again been forced to confront classic questions of whether and how to support, channel, or resist these pressures. Of course, the parallels to Reagan, well, they're not exact, but there are still some certain lessons to be learned from past examples. Conservatives of all people understand that political revolutions frequently end up leading to violent, terrible outcomes unanticipated by the liberal, the idealistic, and the well-meaning. That is crucial. That is also a significant difference between traditional conservatives and the neoconservatives, or what I call the neoliberals, who are far more doctrinaire and are acting much more like liberals, in my humble opinion, than like conservatives. He goes on. Certainly Reagan understood this. Revolutions create power vacuums that are often filled by relatively small groups of well-organized political radicals, militants, extremists. During the Cold War, the most important such groups internationally were communists. Today, the most important such groups are Islamist extremists. Now, to be sure, today's radical Islamists, well, they do not control a global superpower, but they do command the sympathy and support of millions of Muslims and constitute a kind of loose transnational insurgency with a demonstrated capacity for violence. In other words, his point is, how do we defeat them? How do we contain them? Not by toppling our allies. If that's the biggest threat we're facing, ladies and gentlemen, international terrorism, Islamist jihadism, then you don't topple governments or don't support the toppling of governments who are allied with you, fighting them. The professor goes on, in Egypt, the leading organization of radical Islamists is the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the best organized force in that country, outside the nation's army, and well-positioned to take advantage of hurried elections this fall, especially as it works in coalition with leftist political movements. The Brotherhood has a chance to assume meaningful degrees of political power in the coming years. So what are its intentions? Western journalists had tended to suggest during the last few weeks that the Muslim Brotherhood is nothing to worry about, and that it has now evolved to the point where it poses no pressing danger to prospects for a peaceful, liberal, democratic Egypt. Of course, this is exactly what the most sophisticated and militant Muslim Brotherhood would like Western opinion to think, as it makes their task of achieving power a good deal easier. There are certainly interesting factional debates going on within the Brotherhood, yet the stated position of leading brothers in recent years includes the ejection of Western influence from the region, an end to the alliance with the U.S., termination of Egypt's peace treaty with Israel, noxious anti-Semitism, applause for terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, the establishment of strict Islamist rule, and support for indigenous attacks on American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is an encouraging record, to say the least. The point is not that we know exactly what the Brotherhood would do if they took power in Egypt. The point is that we don't. And that's precisely the problem. Maybe they would live up to every liberal's dream of peaceful, democratic political Islam. More probably they would not. Yet an amazing number of Western commentators and officials earlier this year were prepared to publicly and abruptly push Hosni Mubarak out the door, risking the possibility that in the end, a deeply anti-American Muslim Brotherhood will assume increased power in a country of critical regional importance. Whatever this policy amounts to, it is not what Ronald Reagan would have favored in relation to an American ally. You can read the rest of the piece, Real Clear Politics, Colin Dueck, Associate Professor, George Mason University. Let me be as clear as I know how, especially for our friends at the Daily Caller who seem to have screwed up badly what I said yesterday. Well, they got what the clip right, but they didn't have the context right. It is not only impossible, but it is destructive of American interests to pretend that all over the globe that we have the power to enforce God-given unalienable rights. Read George Washington's farewell address. He didn't believe that. None of the founders believed. What they believed is that every human being has God-given unalienable rights. What they did not believe was that America and Americans could be required or could possibly hope to enforce those rights all over the world. That is an outrageous notion, one that is not based in practicality or rationality. We neither have enough human beings in this country to sacrifice to that end, nor enough treasure to sacrifice to that end. The job of the political leadership of the United States of America is to preserve and defend the American society. It's to build alliances with nations and regimes that will help us toward that end. That's the priority of American officials. That is their responsibility, the preservation and security of this society. It's not some global or international objective, and it is to confront enemies that are dangerous to us. Ronald Reagan would not have supported actively taking down Hosni Mubarak, in my humble opinion, just as he opposed efforts to take down the Shah of Iran. Not because he liked dictators, but because he loved his country. We'll be right back. And Bill Kristol came out and said he doesn't think Palin is really ready to be president. I want to point out, I haven't endorsed anybody, I'm not going to, but I want to make clear about something. And these are many fine people, honestly. George Will, Charles Krauthammer, Bill Kristol. Not one of them were active in support of Reagan in 1980. Not one of them. We'll be right back.